Lady Ann Veronica Glenconner has lived her entire life in the shadow of the crown. She was friends with Elizabeth II and served her younger sister, Princess Margaret, for more than 30 years. An executive, friendly, restrained lady in English with an ideal reputation and an exemplary marriage, only now, in her 9th decade, inspired by the wife of the current monarch, Camilla, decided to tell what all these years of silence cost her. Lady Glenconner's book, Maid of Honor, My Extraordinary Life in the Shadow of the Crown, is not only a memory, but also a retribution to the man she once called her husband. Born Lady Anne Cook, she was the first child and eldest daughter of the 5th Earl of Leicester, later equerry to George VI, and his wife Elizabeth York, daughter of the 8th Earl of Hardwicke. Since childhood, Anne has been close to the young princesses Elizabeth and Margaret, who were invited to play at the Leicester's family estate in Norfolk. Anne, although not their equal in position, was a suitable match for reputation and a rich family tree that stretched back 4 centuries. Money has always been tight in the family. Anne's mother, an artist, opened a pottery workshop in Holkham, which helped to keep afloat. From the age of 17, Anne helped her with the work of a sales representative, delivering samples and offering to buy them. However, this chapter of life soon had to be forgotten when the Cookies decided that it was time to marry Anne off. In 1950, she took part in the debutante ball, where she made an indelible impression. A striking beauty, tall, with thick blonde hair, pale skin, and delicate facial features, in the same season she was recognized as the debutante of the year and received many offers from interested gentlemen. Anne remembers them with some irony, and only one thing is being serious about: Johnny Althorpe, the future Earl Spencer, her first love, and the man who broke her heart. There was a date and a crush. Johnny proposed, and Anne agreed. At that time, the girl was living as a paid guest in the house of Elizabeth Hugh's friend, Lady Fermoy, and made the fatal mistake of introducing Johnny to her as her fiancé. Ruth Fermoy's eyes lit up, and in a short time Althorpe was already engaged to her daughter Frances. Their marriage was a disaster, but it resulted in 5 children, one of whom was Diana Spencer, Princess of Wales. The issue of marriage was still open, but soon Colin Tennant, the son and heir of the extremely wealthy 2nd Baron Glenconner, appeared on the horizon. Tall and terribly handsome, women liked him. He could be charming and witty. Anne and Colin got engaged. The wedding at Holkham was held in accordance with the traditions of the landed aristocracy. The bride was wearing a white dress by Norman Hartnell, a leading British fashion designer who holds a royal warrant as Elizabeth Hugh's personal designer. The long gallery was filled with gifts, including a silver inkwell from the Queen. Tenants from both family estates feasted in 3 tents in the park, each with their own wedding cake. Princess Margaret, still unmarried, also attended the chaperone's wedding, and it was there that she met her future husband, Tony Armstrong Jones, the official photographer of the event. The wedding was for Lady Glenconner, the beginning of the life that her mother and many other women in her entourage lived, and the end of everything that Anne had dreamed of since childhood. The celebration was followed by a 6-month tour of Europe, which began in Paris. Anne just hoped that love would do its job, and everything would work out for her and Colin. On our wedding night in Paris, Colin had a tantrum that drove him to exhaustion. Everything that happened was awkward, painful, and not particularly pleasant or romantic. Apparently, it was my fault, recalls Lady Glenconner. A few days later, Tennant, in order to broaden the horizons of his wife, brought her to a dirty, rundown hotel with a strange smell where you could watch other people having sex. "You're hopeless at this, but you'll get a good tip if you watch it," he said at the time. For Lady Glenconner, her very presence in such a place was humiliating. Shocked by what she saw, she closed her eyes and sat very straight, waiting for the end of the torture. Before marriage, Colin Glenconner had many affairs, but he did not consider it his duty to teach his wife anything, did not show the patience or gentleness that she expected. Sex with the spouse constantly ended with criticism and exclamations of disappointment. Tennant was intemperate, often very angry with Anne, and she was just afraid to go to bed with him. The only time Tennant was happy was the night in the Grenadines when Colin slipped something into his wife's cocktail. According to Lady Glenconner, she was overcome with fear, had visions and hallucinations, but eventually she and her husband had passionate sex. In the morning, her husband praised her, and Anne felt terrible. She still doesn't like to remember this experience. How strange and how typical of Colin. Instead of being gentle, he decided that he could just make me do what he likes, Lady Glenconner bitterly recalls. Anne was relieved when, towards the end of the honeymoon, her almost daily suffering was interrupted by morning sickness. Home life soon turned into hell, too, when the cheerful and attractive tenant suddenly flew into a rage for no objective reason. Lady Glenconner learned to sit still like a rabbit while waiting out her husband's next attack. I was amazed to find that I was being blamed for everything that went wrong, or for everything that he thought went wrong. I had to learn very quickly how to deal with his sudden demands, diffuse difficult situations, and quickly repair any damage caused by his behavior. The trigger for the global crisis could be anything. He lost his temper instantly, and I had very little time to fix everything he objected to. I've learned to stay calm, be vigilant, and weather storms, Anne writes. Only once did she turn to her mother for help, but she told her that she would not take her home. "Come back immediately. You married him," said Lady Coop angrily. And it wasn't about cruelty or unwillingness to help her daughter. It was just how everyone lived, not putting problems with her husband on public display, and her mother and all the generations before her. Nothing and no one satisfied Colin for long. Shortly after the family's first child, Charles, was born, Lord Tennant gave unthinkable money for a stable in the London borough of Knightsbridge without consulting Anne. He couldn't stay in one place for long, and the family had to move often. Sometimes Anne found out that the house was sold a couple of weeks before the time when it was necessary to move out. Colin traveled with his family every now and then, and Anne had to carry his luggage like a pack horse, as Tennant said he was not strong enough for this. Husbands from high society, if only their financial situation allowed them, were mostly unfaithful to their wives. For the most part, they just put up with it and didn't make a fuss. Some took their own measures. Anne was one of them. After 10 years of marriage, Lady Glenconner, tired of her husband's endless infidelities, began a relationship with a married man. I was taught to think of divorce as something impossible, but I really needed kindness and care, and this decision changed me for the better in many ways, Anne writes. The affair lasted 34 years until the death of her lover. Sometimes it was just lunch, sometimes it was a rare magical weekend, together if both managed to escape from home. Her friend's wife knew about everything and was kind to Anne. There was no question of leaving the family, but there were agreements, and everyone was satisfied with the opportunity to have their own life outside the house. Colin also knew about everything. He was unhappy in those intervals when no other woman was present in his life. He was so beautiful and perfect, how the hell could she want to be with someone else? However, he could not do anything about this friendship, since he himself had been cheating on Anne almost from the first days of their life together and did not even try to hide it. One relationship was particularly long, and although Colin didn't tell Anne about them, she immediately understood everything when she saw him with another woman at a party. For many years, the Tennants remained in the shadows, but after Lord Glenconner's impulsive purchase of the rundown, uninhabited island Mustique in the Caribbean suddenly became famous. In fact, the island was not completely uninhabited. There was a small settlement here, a few huts without electricity and sewerage with local residents making a living by fishing and selling cotton. Tennant invested a lot of money in Mustique and turned it into an entire estate, installed a drainage system and electricity, planted trees, established trade, and organized pensions for the islanders. When the cotton business declined, Tennant hired architect Oliver Messel, who built several luxury houses on the island for tenants in a style described as Caribbean Palladian. Tennant's neighbor was also Princess Margaret, to whom Lord and Lady Glenconner gave land on the island as a wedding gift. After the divorce, the Queen's younger sister began to appear here much more often. Tennant has created a unique project for the business elite, aristocrats, and celebrities. Impressive, luxurious parties were held here, which could only be entered by invitation. Meanwhile, things were not going well at home with Glenconner, who seemed to revel in popularity and life in his paradise. By the time they'd bought the Mustique, Colin and Anne already had 5 children: Charles, Henry, Christopher, and twins May and Amy. It was difficult for his father to be with them in the house, even during infrequent visits, to show tenderness and patience, and soon all of Colin's heirs were sent to boarding school, which broke the hearts of both the children and their mother. The eldest son, Charles, began to show signs of mental disorder at school, strange fantasies, and obsessive rituals appeared. His parents decided to ignore them in the hope that he would just outgrow them. After all, he was the eldest heir to the barony of Glenconner and the family estate in Scotland. They believed that this was enough to guarantee his future. However, the boy's mental health continued to deteriorate, and at the age of 39, Charles Tennant died from the effects of hepatitis. His brother Henry also had a sad fate. He contracted HIV and passed away as a young man. The Tennant's third son, Christopher, was involved in an accident in Belize. He was brought home in a coma, and his mother was told that he would never be able to recover from the consequences. Lady Glenconner was advised to forget about Christopher and leave him in the care of the Sisters of Mercy, but she refused and tried to bring him out of a comatose state with the help of fabrics with different textures, brushes, and fragrances. Anne sat and talked with her son for hours, stroking him with her hand, until finally he opened his eyes. Anne combined maternal care with service to Princess Margaret, with whom she had become close over the years. When she died 2 years later, Anne completely lost her footing for a while. She hardly saw her husband. After a bohemian life on Mustique, he moved to St. Lucia, where he became close to a local resident, Kent, who became his friend, protege, and personal assistant. They saw very little of Anne. Their only trip to the opera in many years ended in a scandal. The already middle-aged Tennant suddenly howled to the whole hall, "I wish Kent was here." Anne, in front of a stunned audience, had to tear the plate from his lap and throw it over his head like a parrot so that he would finally calm down. In the summer of 2010, Anne visited her husband again in St. Lucia. He was ill with cancer, and this meeting was the last for them. 3 days after Lady Glenconner's visit, Lord Tennant died. It wasn't that bad, was it? Were the last words Anne heard from her husband. Anne flew back to St. Lucia to arrange a decent funeral for her husband. Her husband's will shocked her. Lord Tennant left all movable and immovable property to Kent, depriving both her and her children of inheritance. It took almost 7 years to get through the courts the return of half of her inheritance to her grandson. Anne herself has returned home and lives in the cottage of the family estate in Holcombe, which she bought from her father at a discounted price in the early days of her marriage.